All right, let's go back in time. I want you to picture a young Carl Jung, years before his famous split with Freud, working as a clinical psychiatrist at the renowned Burkholtzli Asylum. He's got a real clinical puzzle on his hands, and today we're going to follow his meticulous quest to define a condition that, well, we now recognize as part of the bipolar spectrum.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to follow Jung's thinking step by step. First, we'll look at the problem of just defining the disorder. Then we'll get into the really fascinating stuff, 4 lives he studied. After that, we'll explore his big idea about emotion versus intellect, and we'll wrap up with the framework he ultimately created. Let's get into it.
Okay, so first things first. We're starting with the fundamental problem facing psychiatry back in the early 1900s. How do you actually diagnose a person who's in a constant, chronic state of elevated mood? The language they had back then was, well, it was a mess. It was this conceptual fog that really got in the way of understanding what was actually going on. So Jung did what great thinkers do. He started by taking on the big names of his time, like the neuropsychiatrist Carl Wernicke. Now, Wernicke had this term, chronic mania, which seemed okay on the surface. It covered the high moods, the conflicts with society, but for Jung, it just wasn't good enough. He basically said, look, this is way too broad. You could throw all sorts of different conditions under this one umbrella. What he needed was a much, much sharper diagnostic tool. And he found that tool in a really interesting term he borrowed from a Dutch psychiatrist, sanguine inferiority. Now, this is a huge shift in thinking, really revolutionary for the time. This term changes the whole game. It's saying this isn't just an illness that comes and goes, like a mania. No, it's something stable, something baked into a person's core personality. It's a spectrum, right? Somewhere between just being a cheerful person and being in a state of full-blown mania. So here's where Jung gets really specific. This is the crucial part. He said for a diagnosis to stick, you need to see the whole package of symptoms, not just one or two. You need the emotional ups and downs, but mostly up. You need the flight of ideas, those racing thoughts. You need the distractibility, the constant restlessness and overactivity, and of course, that exaggerated sense of self-importance. And all of this, he noted, often led to what they called moral defects back then, things like alcoholism. Okay, so a theory is one thing, but you've got to have the evidence to back it up, right? And this is where Jung's work really comes alive. He grounds his whole argument in 4 absolutely fascinating and frankly tragic case studies from his work at the Burkholtzli Asylum. First up, we meet patient A. This guy is brilliant, an incredibly intelligent businessman, but his whole life path just changes after he gets sick as a kid. And what's interesting is this isn't about him losing his intellect. Not at all. It's about his life being totally taken over by this restless energy. He aced his studies but couldn't stick with anything. He was always chasing the next thing, drinking heavily, barely sleeping. It's a textbook hypomanic pattern, and it's what finally brought him to the asylum. And this quote from the patient himself, it's just so telling. You see, I'm the most cultured and well-read, superficial person. Wow. I mean, think about that. He knows. He has this flash of insight into his own condition. He sees his own superficiality, how he jumps from one thing to the next without ever going deep. But seeing it and being able to stop it are 2 totally different things. He was just trapped by that internal engine. Our next case is patient B, a woman whose story is deeply marked by trauma from a young age. Her life is a roller coaster of emotions, swinging wildly from total despair to these intense manic highs. And here, Jung makes a really, really important clinical point. Her alcoholism, her drinking, wasn't the cause of her problems. It was her attempt to cope, to deaden, as she put it, the sheer intensity of her moods. The drinking was a symptom, not the core issue. And just look at this line from one of her letters. Do you believe in my leonine strength? I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? The grandiosity, the confidence, the 2 exclamation points. It's the perfect snapshot of a mind just flying high on this manic energy, completely disconnected from the fact that her life was actually falling apart around her. Case C gives us this incredibly clear picture of pure restlessness, almost like a math problem. Just look at these numbers. An 11-year period, 32 different jobs. That's astonishing. And this wasn't because she was bad at her job. She was a great nurse, people liked her, but she just could not stay in one place. After a while, she'd just get sick of it and have to move on. It was an overwhelming internal pressure.
And Jung's note here really hits the nail on the head. He says she could only stick around until the novelty wore off. Once she knew the area, knew the people, that internal itch would start, and she had to find something new. It wasn't about her being bad at her job or getting into fights. It was a pure, insatiable need for novelty, a restless urge that she just couldn't control.
Okay, our last case, patient D, is maybe the most extreme example of all. And it's interesting, this kind of thing ran in his family. His life is just this wild contradiction. On the one hand, he's a vagabond, living in total poverty, literally starving and sleeping in barns. But on the other hand, in his mind, he's a messiah, a prophet, the founder of God's kingdom. The gap between his reality and his self-perception is just immense. And this quote, it's from his own writings. It's almost poetic, isn't it? But it shows you just how powerful his internal world was. His physical body could be freezing and miserable, but his mind was in this completely different, grandiose reality. The mood state was so all-consuming that it created a world of its own, totally sealed off from his actual circumstances. So, looking at these 4 lives, Jung starts to build a much bigger theory. This goes way beyond just diagnosing a single disorder. He uses these cases to argue for a pretty radical idea about what makes us tick, one that really pushes back against the idea that we're all just logical, rational beings. Now, to help build his case, he brings in the philosopher Schopenhauer. I know, this quote looks a little dense, but the core idea is actually pretty straightforward and powerful. It's basically saying, you do what you do because of who you are. Our actions aren't the product of some cold, rational calculation. They are the necessary result of our fundamental character. In a way, character is destiny. And this brings us to Jung's core argument about how our minds work. He's saying there's a hierarchy, and at the top isn't reason or intellect, it's affect, our fundamental underlying emotional state or feeling tone. That's what really drives the bus. Our intellect? It's more like a passenger, a really smart passenger for sure. Think of it like a lawyer who's been hired to defend a client's actions. The lawyer didn't decide on the action, but its job is to come up with a really good, logical-sounding reason for why it happened after the fact. Okay, so we've seen the problem, we've looked at the evidence from these 4 lives, and we've unpacked the theory. Now, let's bring it all home and look at the final, concise framework that Jung built from all this work. He boils it all down to 3 essential takeaways that completely redefine this condition. So here it is. First, he establishes that this isn't just a phase, it's a stable, core part of a person's makeup, often visible from a young age. Second, sure, you can see periods where the symptoms get worse, but this third point, this is the real game changer. All those moral problems, the alcoholism, the instability, they aren't the root cause. They are symptoms that depend on the underlying mood disorder. It completely reframes the issue. It's not about a bad person, it's about a disorder that causes the behavior society labels as bad. And so that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. You know, today we talk a lot about brain chemistry, we talk about therapy techniques, and yet here's Jung over a century ago pointing to this deep, fundamental feeling tone as the thing that really drives our lives. It feels both old-fashioned and incredibly modern at the same time, and it pushes us to ask a really tough question. How much of what you do every day is a conscious choice, and how much is just the inevitable expression of who you fundamentally are?